What popular rumor in your school turned out to be true? Story 1. In high school, there was this wild rumor that Mr. Jensen, our quirky science teacher with his endless collection of mismatched bow ties, was living in the janitor's closet. It sounded like a joke, but people swore they saw him leaving the school late at night with his thermos and coming back early before anyone else. One Friday after school, a couple of us hung around to see if we could catch him. Sure enough, around 6 p.m., we saw him casually walking down the hallway toward the closet. Heart pounding, I dared my friend to go peek. She cracked the door open just as he went inside. What did we see? A tiny setup, mini fridge, a microwave, a foldable cot, and a pile of bow ties in the corner. Suddenly, the door flung open, and there he was. "Science is a 24/7 job," he said with a completely straight face. We bolted. From then on, every time I saw him at school, I couldn't stop picturing him tucking himself in between the mops and brooms. Story 2. There was this persistent rumor that Emily, the quiet girl who always sat at the back of class sketching, had been expelled from her old school for graffiti. No one knew if it was true, but people whispered about how one of her old murals went viral online before mysteriously disappearing. One day, the principal walked into homeroom, furious. Someone had spray-painted a massive, detailed portrait of the school mascot on the gym wall overnight. Security cameras didn't catch anything, but the style looked familiar. Everyone's eyes darted to Emily, who just sat there doodling like nothing happened. A week later, she stopped coming to school. No explanation, no goodbyes. But the gym wall? That stayed untouched. People still call it Emily's legacy. Story 3. Our PE teacher, Coach Daniels, was this gruff, no-nonsense guy who always wore a whistle like it was his lifeline. Someone started a rumor that he used to play professional baseball but got banned for punching an umpire. It sounded ridiculous, but then something happened during a softball game. One of the seniors kept mocking Coach, saying he couldn't hit anymore. Without a word, Coach grabbed a bat, stepped up to the plate, and told the pitcher to give him his best. The pitch came in, and Coach smashed it so hard the ball cleared the fence and landed in the parking lot. Dead silence. Later, I looked him up online and found an article about a Daniels incident in the minor leagues. No details, just speculation about anger issues. The rumor wasn't just true, it felt like it didn't even cover the half of it. Story 4. At my school, the craziest rumor was that Principal Carter, a quiet guy who wore beige suits and always had a mug of tea, had been a secret agent. No one believed it until senior prank day, when things got weird. The prank was harmless. A group of kids blocked his car in the lot with cones and streamers. We watched from the cafeteria, expecting him to yell or call security. Instead, he climbed onto the roof of his car, leaped over the barricade like an Olympic athlete, and landed perfectly. Edit. I ran into him years later at a coffee shop and asked about the rumor. He smiled, leaned in, and said, "Some secrets are best left unsaid." Still gives me chills. Story 5. Sophomore year, a rumor started that Lisa, the valedictorian, was secretly failing math and paying someone to do her homework. It sounded ridiculous. Lisa was practically perfect at everything. But then, during a big math competition, something happened that no one expected. She was up against some kid from another school and couldn't solve the easiest question. The room got awkwardly quiet as the timer ticked down, and Lisa just froze. After that, people started talking. Turns out, she had a tutor who helped her a little too much. Lisa ended up transferring schools a month later. No one talks about her perfect GPA anymore. Story 11. Sophomore year, there was a rumor that Mr. Price, our overly enthusiastic drama teacher, had once auditioned for a major Hollywood role and completely blown it. Most people thought it was just a joke, because he seemed like the kind of guy who had never left the small-town theater scene. One day during play rehearsals, someone asked him directly, Did you ever try out for a movie? He laughed nervously, but didn't deny it. Later, someone dug up an old audition tape on YouTube. There he was, younger and way more dramatic, delivering the worst one-liner anyone had ever heard. The video even had a comment from a famous director saying, "This was painful to watch." The next day, everyone in class was quoting the line back to him. Mr. Price finally admitted it. "Yeah, I tried. And failed. Miserably. But hey, at least I'm a legend here, right?" The best part? We started using his line as the title of our school play that year. Story 12. There was this girl, Chloe, who transferred to our school junior year, and rumors spread like wildfire that she wasn't a regular student. The wildest theory? She was actually 21 and had been forced to redo high school because of some legal mess. At first, it sounded crazy, but Chloe was different. She knew way too much about taxes, owned a car nicer than any teacher's, and had an encyclopedic knowledge of random laws. One Friday, someone spotted her leaving a courthouse downtown, wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase. By Monday, the rumors had doubled. When someone confronted her in the cafeteria, asking if she was secretly an adult, she just smiled and said, "Age is just a number, right?" Months later, she suddenly stopped showing up. No explanation, no goodbye. Her name wasn't even in the yearbook. Everyone swore there was something bigger going on, but no one ever figured it out. Story 13. Our school's sweet cafeteria lady, Mrs. Hall, had this rumor swirling around that she'd been arrested for tax fraud years ago. It seemed ridiculous. She was always smiling, slipping extra cookies to kids who looked stressed, and decorating the lunch line with cheerful holiday cutouts. Then someone found an old newspaper clipping online about a Margaret Hall, who had been part of a massive tax evasion scandal involving millions of dollars. When someone brought it up to her one day, Mrs. Hall just chuckled and said, "Oh, I've always been good with numbers. I just wasn't great at rules." From then on, kids would joke about buying off-menu items, and Mrs. Hall played along. The funny thing? No one really cared. She made the best brownies in the world, and as far as we were concerned, that was all that mattered. Story 14. Senior year, there was a rumor about Jake, the class clown, being secretly brilliant. Supposedly, he had an IQ higher than Einstein's, but purposely bombed tests to stay under the radar. It sounded like total nonsense. Jake spent most of his time goofing off and drawing cartoons on the back of his math quizzes. But then, during a physics competition, the school's top student got sick, and Jake had to fill in. He walked up to the stage looking like he'd just woken up, glanced at the problem for 3 seconds, and wrote the correct answer before anyone else had even started. The judges were stunned. Afterward, someone asked him how he did it, and Jake shrugged. "It's not hard. I just don't see the point in showing off all the time." From that day on, people treated him like a mix of a genius and a superhero. But Jake? He went right back to doodling in class. Edit. Years later, someone spotted Jake working at NASA. He apparently designed part of a rover, but according to him, it's just a side project. Story 15. There was this rumor about Sarah, the girl who always volunteered for everything, secretly running a business out of her locker. It sounded fake because Sarah was the definition of overachiever. Student council president, honor roll, you name it. Then one day, a teacher opened her locker during a random search and found boxes of candy, chips, and soda packed neatly inside. Sarah claimed it was for fundraising, but everyone knew better. Turns out, she'd been running a full-on snack operation, selling everything the cafeteria didn't stock. The school shut her down, but not before Sarah made enough money to pay for a new laptop. To this day, people still call her CEO Sarah. Story 16. In sophomore year, there was a rumor that Mr. Nelson, our chemistry teacher, had set his old university lab on fire and gotten banned from teaching at colleges. It sounded too wild to be true. Mr. Nelson was soft-spoken, always wore the same brown cardigan and looked like he wouldn't even light a match without reading the instructions. Then one day, he was explaining combustion reactions in class and said, "And this is why you always double-check your setup, unless you want to evacuate a building." Dead silence. Someone immediately asked, "Wait, did you actually do that?" He smiled awkwardly and mumbled, "Accidents happen." Later, a classmate found an old university newspaper article online about a mysterious explosion in the chem lab that forced the evacuation of 2 buildings. No names were mentioned, but the date matched perfectly. From then on, we called him Mad Scientist behind his back, but he never seemed to mind. Story 17. There was a rumor in my junior year that Max, the quiet kid who sat in the back of the room doodling, was in witness protection. At first, it seemed like a joke. Why would anyone think Max, the kid who barely said 3 words a day, was hiding from the mafia? But then, people started noticing things. He didn't have any social media, never talked about his family, and always avoided group photos. One day, during a class discussion, someone joked, "Max, blink twice if you're in hiding." Everyone laughed, but Max just smiled and didn't say a word. Then, halfway through the semester, he disappeared for 2 weeks. When he came back, he had a completely different haircut and a brand new backpack, acting like nothing had happened. After that, the rumor became school-wide gospel. People claimed they saw him leaving school with men in suits, and someone even swore he spoke fluent Italian once by accident. Whether it was true or not, Max never confirmed or denied anything. He just kept drawing. Story 18. Our gym teacher, Coach Turner, was infamous for talking about his glory days. Every other sentence started with, "Back when I was playing." Someone eventually started a rumor that he got banned from minor league baseball for flipping over a referee's table during a game. Most of us thought it was fake. Coach Turner loved to brag, but he didn't seem that unhinged. That was until a rainy day gym class when someone asked, "Coach, is it true you got banned from baseball?" He paused mid-whistle, gave the kid a long look, and said, "Sometimes, bad calls deserve dramatic responses." That was it. No denial, no explanation. Later that week, someone found a grainy video of a young Coach Turner screaming at a referee, flipping a scorer's table, and storming off the field. It was chaotic and glorious. After that, anytime Coach yelled during practice, someone would whisper, "Careful, or he'll flip the bleachers." Story 19. Senior year, Rachel was the golden child of our school. Straight A's, captain of debate, and said to be valedictorian. Then someone started a rumor that Rachel's mom was the real mastermind behind her success, writing all her essays and even helping her with speeches. It sounded like pure jealousy. Rachel was sharp and confident, so no one really believed it. That is, until a peer review session in English class. A classmate noticed Rachel's essay sounded different. The style was overly polished, like it had been written by a seasoned academic. When someone pointed it out, Rachel shrugged and said, "My mom edits everything for me. It's no big deal." The story spread like wildfire. By the time graduation rolled around, Rachel wasn't valedictorian anymore. The school claimed it was due to unforeseen circumstances, but everyone knew the truth. Story 20. Sophomore year, there was this rumor about Marcus, the kid who always sat alone in the library. People said he was banned from every online gaming platform for cheating in a world championship. It sounded ridiculous. Marcus was quiet, nerdy, and barely interacted with anyone. But when someone brought it up to him, he just smiled and said, "Those tournaments are way too easy." One day during lunch, someone dared him to prove it. Marcus pulled out his laptop and within minutes, hacked into an online games leaderboard. He didn't just win, he completely dominated, pulling off moves no one even knew were possible. The entire cafeteria watched in awe as he explained every trick he was using. By the end of the week, Marcus was suspended for unauthorized use of school Wi-Fi, and his parents were called in. But to us, he became a legend. People still call him the Hacker King to this day. Story 21. There was this rumor about Mr. Collins, our history teacher, being married to a celebrity. He was this unassuming guy with a bow tie collection and a habit of talking about the Civil War like it was yesterday. The idea of him having a famous wife seemed impossible, until one day someone spotted him at a local coffee shop with a woman who looked exactly like a retired soap opera actress. By Monday, the rumor spread like wildfire. When someone asked him about it in class, he just smiled and said, "History isn't the only drama I enjoy." That only made things worse. A group of us decided to do some research and found an old magazine cover from the 90s with his wife on it. In the corner, there was a tiny blurb, "Married to college sweetheart." The next day, the school practically erupted. People started asking him for autographs on behalf of his wife, and even the principal joked about getting her to do a guest lecture on the history of soap operas. Mr. Collins never confirmed or denied it, but he also didn't stop us from believing it. Story 22. Junior year, there was a rumor that Sam, the new transfer student, was related to royalty. At first, no one took it seriously. He wore old sneakers and hoodies like everyone else, and he definitely didn't act fancy. But then people started noticing strange details. His accent was a little too polished. He always had these super expensive pens, and he got weirdly uncomfortable when anyone asked about his family. The tipping point came during a school field trip to a museum. Sam casually mentioned that he'd been there before, for a private tour, and then proceeded to correct the tour guide on some obscure historical facts. Someone joked, "What are you, a prince or something?" And Sam just laughed nervously and walked away. A week later, a picture of him surfaced online. He was at some gala, wearing a suit and standing next to actual European royals. When someone confronted him about it, he just shrugged and said, "We're distant relatives. It's no big deal." No big deal? After that, people started calling him "Your Majesty" in the hallways, and he pretended not to hear. Story 23. In senior year, there was this rumor that Jenny, the girl who was always winning academic awards, had a photographic memory. It seemed believable. Jenny never took notes in class, aced every test, and could recite entire chapters from textbooks without missing a word. But she never talked about it, which only made people more curious. One day, during a school trivia competition, Jenny's team was losing badly. Then, in the last round, she suddenly answered every single question with lightning speed, including the exact year and page number for a random historical fact. The crowd went nuts. Afterwards, someone asked her if the rumors were true. She smiled and said, "I just have a good memory." But her tone made it clear there was more to the story. From then on, people started testing her with random trivia in the hallways, and she always knew the answer. Story 19. Senior year, Rachel was the golden child of our school. Straight A's, captain of debate, and said to be valedictorian. Then someone started a rumor that Rachel's mom was the real mastermind behind her success, writing all her essays and even helping her with speeches. It sounded like pure jealousy. Rachel was sharp and confident, so no one really believed it. That is, until a peer review session in English class. A classmate noticed Rachel's essay sounded different. The style was overly polished, like it had been written by a seasoned academic. When someone pointed it out, Rachel shrugged and said, "My mom edits everything for me. It's no big deal." The story spread like wildfire. By the time graduation rolled around, Rachel wasn't valedictorian anymore. The school claimed it was due to unforeseen circumstances, but everyone knew the truth. Story 20. Sophomore year, there was this rumor about Marcus, the kid who always sat alone in the library. People said he was banned from every online gaming platform for cheating in a world championship. It sounded ridiculous. Marcus was quiet, nerdy, and barely interacted with anyone. But when someone brought it up to him, he just smiled and said, "Those tournaments are way too easy." One day during lunch, someone dared him to prove it. Marcus pulled out his laptop and within minutes hacked into an online game's leaderboard. He didn't just win, he completely dominated, pulling off moves no one even knew were possible. The entire cafeteria watched in awe as he explained every trick he was using. By the end of the week, Marcus was suspended for unauthorized use of school Wi-Fi, and his parents were called in. But to us, he became a legend. People still call him the Hacker King to this day. Story 21. There was this rumor about Mr. Collins, our history teacher, being married to a celebrity. He was this unassuming guy with a bow tie collection and the habit of talking about the Civil War like it was yesterday. The idea of him having a famous wife seemed impossible, until one day someone spotted him at a local coffee shop with a woman who looked exactly like a retired soap opera actress. By Monday, the rumor spread like wildfire. When someone asked him about it in class, he just smiled and said, "History isn't the only drama I enjoy." That only made things worse. A group of us decided to do some research and found an old magazine cover from the 90s with his wife on it. In the corner, there was a tiny blurb, "Married to college sweetheart." The next day, the school practically erupted. People started asking him for autographs on behalf of his wife, and even the principal joked about getting her to do a guest lecture on the history of soap operas. Mr. Collins never confirmed or denied it, but he also didn't stop us from believing it. Story 22. Junior year, there was a rumor that Sam, the new transfer student, was related to royalty. At first, no one took it seriously. He wore old sneakers and hoodies like everyone else, and he definitely didn't act fancy. But then people started noticing strange details. His accent was a little too polished. He always had these super expensive pens, and he got weirdly uncomfortable when anyone asked about his family. The tipping point came during a school field trip to a museum. Sam casually mentioned that he'd been there before, for a private tour, and then proceeded to correct the tour guide on some obscure historical facts. Someone joked, "What are you, a prince or something?" And Sam just laughed nervously and walked away. A week later, a picture of him surfaced online. He was at some gala, wearing a suit and standing next to actual European royals. When someone confronted him about it, he just shrugged and said, "We're distant relatives. It's no big deal." No big deal. After that, people started calling him Your Majesty in the hallways, and he pretended not to hear. Story 23. In senior year, there was this rumor that Jenny, the girl who was always winning academic awards, had a photographic memory. It seemed believable. Jenny never took notes in class, aced every test, and could recite entire chapters from textbooks without missing a word. But she never talked about it, which only made people more curious. One day, during a school trivia competition, Jenny's team was losing badly. Then, in the last round, she suddenly answered every single question with lightning speed, including the exact year and page number for a random historical fact. The crowd went nuts. Afterward, someone asked her if the rumors were true. She smiled and said, "I just have a good memory." But her tone made it clear there was more to the story. From then on, people started testing her with random trivia in the hallways, and she always knew the answer. Story 24. There was this rumor about our vice principal, Mrs. Turner, being a former spy. It sounded ridiculous. Mrs. Turner was the definition of strict and boring, with her perfectly pressed suits and clipboard that never left her side. But then someone noticed she had a habit of scanning the hallways like she was on patrol. One day, during a fire drill, Mrs. Turner spotted a kid trying to sneak off campus. Instead of yelling, she sprinted after him, tackled him like a linebacker, and dragged him back to the building. No one could believe it. Later, someone found an old newspaper article with a picture of a woman who looked exactly like her, listed as a government consultant. When someone asked her about it, she said, "Let's just say I've handled worse than teenagers." After that, students started calling her Agent Turner, and she didn't even correct them. Story 25. Sophomore year, there was a rumor that Lucy, the school's star artist, had her paintings displayed in a major gallery. It sounded fake because Lucy was quiet, never bragged, and only ever painted in the art room during lunch. But then one day, our art teacher mentioned that Lucy's work had been recognized nationally, and everyone's ears perked up. A group of us decided to dig deeper. We found a gallery website showcasing a painting that looked exactly like Lucy's style, listed under Anonymous Young Talent. When we showed it to her, she got super flustered and said, "I don't know what you're talking about." A month later, The rumor was confirmed when the local news ran a story about a high school prodigy whose work sold for thousands of dollars. Lucy didn't come to school the next day. When she did, people kept asking her for autographs, but she just laughed and said, "I'm still broke." Story 26. In senior year, a bizarre rumor spread that Mr. Thompson, the grumpy old janitor who barely spoke to anyone, was a retired millionaire. It sounded completely made up because Mr. Thompson wore the same faded coveralls every day and drove an ancient pickup truck that looked like it was held together with duct tape. But then one day, during career day, someone asked him why he still worked if he hated kids so much. Without missing a beat, he said, "Gotta stay busy or life gets boring." When someone pressed further, he added, "Retirement isn't all it's cracked up to be." That got people talking. The next week, someone saw Mr. Thompson at a car dealership, writing a check for a brand new luxury SUV. When another student swore they saw him leaving a meeting with the school board, carrying what looked like a property deed, the rumors exploded. People started saying he owned half the land in town and only worked at the school because he missed manual labor. By the end of the year, students started jokingly calling him Mr. Moneybags. Mr. Thompson never confirmed anything, but he didn't deny it either. Story 27. Sophomore year, a rumor spread that Olivia, the quiet girl who always wore oversized hoodies and sat in the back of the class, was secretly a published author. It seemed impossible because Olivia barely spoke, let alone bragged about anything. But then someone claimed they saw her reading a book with her own name on the cover during lunch. The next day, a group of students brought it up in class. "Olivia, did you write a book?" She turned bright red and mumbled, "It's not a big deal." Naturally, that just made everyone more curious. A few kids decided to investigate and found a self-published novel under her name on a popular ebook site. It had hundreds of reviews, most of them glowing. By the end of the week, Olivia was the talk of the school. She finally admitted it, but downplayed the whole thing, saying, "It's just something I do for fun." Fun or not, her sales skyrocketed after everyone in school downloaded a copy. Story 28. There was a wild rumor in junior year that Coach Ramirez, our football coach, used to be a professional wrestler. At first, no one believed it because Coach was built like a wrestler, sure, but he was way too calm and patient to fit the stereotype. Then one day, during a pep rally, the wrestling team challenged the football team to a friendly match. When no one stepped up, Coach Ramirez casually walked onto the mat. What happened next was insane. He flipped the captain of the wrestling team like it was nothing, locked him into a hold, and pinned him in under a minute. The entire gym went silent before erupting into cheers. Afterward, someone found an old wrestling promo poster online with a guy who looked just like him, billed as the Matador. When asked about it, Coach just smiled and said, "I've had a few hobbies." From then on, every pep rally ended with people chanting, "Matador, Matador." Story 29. Sophomore year, a rumor started that Emma, the girl who always sat in the front row and asked way too many questions, had been expelled from her last school for hacking into their grading system. No one believed it because Emma was the definition of a teacher's pet, with perfect grades and a spotless reputation. But then one day, during a pop quiz, the teacher accidentally left the answer key on the desk. Emma noticed it, pointed it out, and said, "You might want to hide that better next time." The way she said it was so nonchalant that it immediately raised suspicions. Later, someone found a news article about a mystery hacker who had breached the high school's database to fix errors. The article didn't name names, but the timeline matched perfectly. Emma denied it when asked, but her classmates weren't convinced. From that point on, everyone joked about asking her to adjust their grades. Story 30. Senior year, there was a rumor that the art teacher, Mrs. Whitman, had once been a professional tattoo artist. It seemed far-fetched because Mrs. Whitman was soft-spoken, wore long sleeves year-round, and spent most of her time teaching us how to draw fruit bowls. Then one day, during an art club meeting, someone asked her if she had any tattoos. She hesitated for a moment before rolling up her sleeve to reveal an intricate, full-sleeve design that looked straight out of a gallery. The room erupted in gasps. When someone asked if she did it herself, She laughed and said, "No, but I've done work like this before." That was all it took. A few students found an old Instagram page under the name Ink by Wit, featuring dozens of jaw-dropping designs. Mrs. Whitman never mentioned it again, but after that she started giving extra credit for drawing tattoo designs instead of still life. Story 31. In junior year, there was a rumor that Mr. Avery, our geography teacher, had once been a treasure hunter. It sounded like something out of a movie, because Mr. Avery was a calm, middle-aged guy with glasses and a map collection, not Indiana Jones. But he had this way of talking about hidden cities and ancient ruins that made you wonder. One day, during class, someone jokingly asked, "Mr. Avery, ever dig up anything valuable?" He smirked and said, "Define valuable." The class erupted in laughter, but that little comment sparked a school-wide obsession. People started Googling his name, and someone found a picture of a younger Mr. Avery in a magazine article about an archaeological expedition. The caption mentioned he had helped uncover artifacts worth millions. When confronted, Mr. Avery said, "That was a long time ago, and I wasn't looking for treasure. I was studying history." From then on, students started leaving random gold coins and fake maps on his desk. He pretended to be annoyed, but every once in a while, he'd grin like he was remembering something incredible. Story 32. There was this rumor in sophomore year that Lauren, the girl who sat quietly in the back of every class, was a martial arts champion. At first, no one believed it because Lauren was tiny, barely spoke, and avoided gym class like it was the plague. But then one day, during a heated dodgeball game, everything changed. A kid from the football team threw a ball at her with full force, aiming straight for her head. Lauren ducked, spun, and caught the ball in one fluid motion. The entire gym went silent. Then she smirked, whipped the ball back, and knocked the guy out of the game. Word spread like wildfire. Someone claimed they saw her at a martial arts tournament last summer, winning a gold medal. When asked about it, Lauren just shrugged and said, "I used to compete a little." After that, no one ever tried to mess with her again. Story 33. Senior year, a rumor started that the biology teacher, Mrs. Carter, had once been a wildlife photographer for National Geographic. It sounded ridiculous because Mrs. Carter was the definition of ordinary. She wore sensible shoes, kept her hair in a tight bun, and always seemed more interested in dissecting frogs than anything adventurous. But then one day, during a slideshow about ecosystems, she accidentally clicked too far ahead and pulled up a picture of herself holding a giant camera while standing next to a lion. The class went nuts. Someone yelled, "Wait! Go back! Is that you?" Mrs. Carter sighed and said, "Yes, but this isn't relevant to today's lesson." Of course, that only made everyone more curious. By the end of the week, someone found an old interview where she talked about spending years photographing wildlife in Africa. After that, students started leaving toy animals on her desk and asking her if she'd wrestled any crocodiles. Mrs. Carter just rolled her eyes, but every now and then, you'd catch her smiling. Story 34. In junior year, a rumor spread that Mike, the kid who never seemed to care about school, was secretly a musical prodigy. It sounded insane because Mike barely showed up to class, let alone participated in anything that required effort. But then one day during an assembly, the jazz band's pianist called in sick, and the music teacher asked if anyone could fill in. To everyone's shock, Mike casually walked up to the stage, sat down, and started playing this insane jazz solo. It wasn't just good. It was the kind of performance that left the entire auditorium speechless. By the time he finished, people were giving him a standing ovation. When asked how he learned to play like that, Mike just shrugged and said, "My dad taught me." It turned out his dad was a famous jazz musician, and Mike had been playing piano since he was 5. After that, he got a standing invite to every school concert, but he only showed up when he felt like it. Story 35. Sophomore year, a wild rumor spread that Olivia, the girl who always showed up late to class, had her own business. At first, no one believed it because Olivia barely seemed interested in school, let alone something as serious as running a company. But then people started noticing things. She always had the newest phone, wore designer shoes, and once casually mentioned client meetings. One day, during a group project, someone finally asked her what she did. Olivia smirked and said, "I sell stuff online." When pressed for details, she added, "Let's just say people like my designs." That was the understatement of the year. Someone eventually found her social media account, where she sold custom clothing she designed herself. Her page had thousands of followers, and her work was featured in a local fashion show. When the principal found out, he called her into his office to make sure she wasn't breaking any rules. Olivia came back to class smiling and said, "Turns out, entrepreneurship is highly encouraged." After that, she became a school legend, with half the students trying to pitch her ideas for collabs. Story 36. Senior year, there was this bizarre rumor that Mr. Grady, the school's strictest math teacher, was a professional poker player. It sounded insane. Mr. Grady was the kind of guy who refused to let you chew gum in his class and handed out pop quizzes like they were candy. But then people started noticing things. He'd casually mention probability in ways that sounded less like teaching and more like he'd lived it. One day, during a class discussion on statistics, someone joked, "Mr. Grady, are you sure you're not just counting cards in your spare time?" He froze for a second, then smiled and said, "It's not cheating if it's math." The class erupted, but he didn't elaborate. Later, someone found an old YouTube clip of a poker tournament with a man who looked just like him, wearing sunglasses and raking in chips. The name was slightly different, but it was definitely him. When asked about it, Mr. Grady just said, "Let's keep this between us, okay?" After that, kids started calling him the Math Shark, and he didn't even bother to correct them. Story 37. In junior year, a rumor spread that Kate, the quiet girl who never hung out with anyone, was actually an undercover journalist working on a big story. At first, everyone laughed it off. Kate barely spoke and always seemed glued to her notebook. But then people started noticing that she was everywhere. Basketball games, student council meetings, even after-school detention. The turning point came when a teacher accidentally confiscated her notebook during class. Everyone watched as the teacher flipped through it, frowned, and handed it back without saying a word. After class, someone asked Kate what was in the notebook. She smirked and said, "Just observations." A few months later, the school paper published an anonymous exposé about some shady budget cuts that had been quietly sweeping through the district. The details were too specific, and everyone immediately assumed it was Kate. She never admitted it, but after that, people started calling her Snoop Kate and jokingly asking if they were going to end up in her next article. Story 38. Sophomore year, a rumor started about Mr. Jenkins, the shop teacher, having been on a survival reality show. It sounded ridiculous because Mr. Jenkins was this laid-back guy who spent most of his time teaching us how to use power tools without losing a finger. But he always had these random wilderness tips, like how to make a fire out of almost anything, and people started connecting the dots. Then one day, during class, someone asked him directly, "Mr. Jenkins, were you on TV?" He looked up from the wood he was sanding and said, "I signed a non-disclosure agreement." The class exploded. Later, someone found an old season of a survival show and spotted a contestant who looked suspiciously like Mr. Jenkins, only younger and scruffier. The guy lasted until the final 3 before tapping out after a storm wrecked his camp. When we asked him again, he just said, "I got really good at eating bugs. That's all I'll say." From then on, we treated him like a legend, and every shop class felt like secret survival training. Story 39. Senior year, there was a rumor that Mia, the school's quietest girl, was training to be an Olympic gymnast. It seemed absurd because Mia avoided gym class and always wore baggy clothes that hid her frame. But then, during a school assembly, something happened that no one could explain. The basketball team was doing a halftime show, and one of the players tripped, accidentally knocking over a stack of chairs. Without hesitation, Mia jumped from the bleachers, flipped over a chair, and landed perfectly while grabbing the falling stack. The entire gym froze. Word spread like wildfire. Someone claimed they saw her leaving a gymnastics gym late at night, and another swore they saw her name on a junior nationals roster. When asked about it, Mia just smiled and said, I practice sometimes. But after that, everyone started treating her like a celebrity, and people would randomly ask her to do flips in the hallways. Story 40. There was a wild rumor in sophomore year that our principal, Mr. Carter, owned a failing theme park. At first, it seemed too ridiculous to be true. Mr. Carter was the definition of straight-laced, always in a suit, always about rules, and never one to joke around. But then someone noticed he kept a framed picture of a roller coaster on his desk. The rumor really took off when a group of students found an old flyer for a theme park, 2 towns over, listing Carter Family Entertainment as the owner. The park had been shut down years ago, but people started speculating that Mr. Carter was still trying to revive it. One day, during a school assembly, someone yelled, "Hey, Mr. Carter, how's the theme park business?" The room went silent. Mr. Carter paused, adjusted his tie, and said, "If you think running a high school is stressful, try keeping a Ferris wheel running." The room erupted in laughter, but he never said another word about it. From that day on, everyone called him Roller Coaster Carter, and he didn't even try to stop it. Story 41. In junior year, there was a rumor that Mrs. Harper, our English teacher, had been a ghostwriter for famous novels. It sounded absurd because Mrs. Harper was this quiet, unassuming woman who graded essays with the enthusiasm of someone watching paint dry. But then someone noticed that she had an uncanny ability to predict literary twists. During a discussion about a popular mystery series, she casually said, "You'll see in book 3, the killer is actually her brother." A week later, the book came out, and she was right. That got people talking. Someone found a list of authors known to use ghostwriters and pointed out how some of their books suddenly got better around the same time Mrs. Harper started teaching. When asked about it, she just smiled and said, "Good writing is good writing." The real kicker came when a kid jokingly asked her to edit his short story for fun. She marked it up with notes so detailed that the kid entered a writing competition and won. After that, students started sneaking her their essays, hoping for some of her magic touch. She never admitted to anything, but she didn't deny it either. Story 42. Sophomore year, a rumor spread that Liam, the quiet kid who always sat alone in the library, had built his own app and sold it for millions. At first, it sounded ridiculous. Liam barely spoke, wore the same hoodie every day, and looked more likely to fix your Wi-Fi than become a tech mogul. But then people started noticing things. He always had the newest gadgets and once casually mentioned he was saving up for a Tesla. The turning point came during a computer science class. The teacher was struggling with some buggy software, and Liam muttered, "I could fix that." When the teacher challenged him, Liam typed furiously for 5 minutes, hit enter, and made the program work flawlessly. The whole class stared. Someone asked, "How did you learn that?" And Liam shrugged, saying, "I've been coding since I was 8. Later, a classmate found an app on the App Store with Liam's name in the credits. It had over 1 million downloads. When confronted, Liam just said, "It's nothing special." But the rumor lived on. By the end of the year, people were asking him for investment advice. Story 43. Senior year, a rumor started that Coach Wilson, the track coach, had once qualified for the Olympics. At first, no one believed it because Coach Wilson was older, a bit overweight, and didn't seem like the type to sprint anywhere. But then, during a practice, one of the runners started bragging about his 100-meter time. Without warning, Coach Wilson kicked off his sneakers, lined up at the start, and said, "Let's see what you've got." When the whistle blew, Coach Wilson left the kid in the dust. The entire team went wild. Afterwards, someone asked if he'd ever competed professionally. He just smiled and said, "I ran a little." That was an understatement. A few days later, someone found an old video of an Olympic trials race with a younger version of Coach Wilson running neck and neck with the country's best sprinters. He didn't make the team, but his time was faster than anyone at school could even dream of. After that, students started calling him Coach Lightning, and he became a legend. Story 44. In junior year, there was this wild rumor that Sarah, the girl who was always sketching in her notebook, had designed a logo for a major brand. It seemed too crazy to be true. Sarah was quiet, kept to herself, and never showed her work to anyone. But then, during art class, the teacher mentioned how some students are already building professional portfolios, and looked right at Sarah. That got people curious. A few days later, someone spotted Sarah wearing a hoodie with a logo that looked suspiciously like a new design for a big-name clothing company. When asked about it, she blushed and said, "It's just a coincidence." Eventually, someone found an interview with the brand's creative director, where they credited a young freelance artist with the design. Sarah still refused to admit it, but her sudden upgrade to a new laptop and art supplies spoke volumes. From that point on, everyone treated her like a celebrity, constantly asking her to design their club posters and t-shirts. Story 45. Sophomore year, there was this bizarre rumor about Mr. Davis, the school's IT guy, being a retired hacker. It sounded like a joke because Mr. Davis was this laid-back dude who always showed up late to fix the Wi-Fi and made terrible dad jokes. But he had a weird habit of solving tech problems way too fast, like he already knew exactly what was wrong. One day, during a computer lab session, someone's project got corrupted, and the student freaked out. Mr. Davis strolled in, glanced at the screen, and typed a string of commands so fast it didn't even look real. The file was restored in seconds. When asked how he did it, he just grinned and said, "Let's just say I've been around the block." Later, someone found an article about a hacker group from the early 2000s that mentioned a Davis as one of its members. When confronted, Mr. Davis said, "Hey, that was a long time ago, and I prefer the term cybersecurity enthusiast." From then on, kids started calling him Mr. Firewall, and he didn't seem to mind. Story 46. In senior year, there was this rumor about Mrs. Lang, our music teacher, having played the violin for a world-famous orchestra. It sounded far-fetched because Mrs. Lang was so modest and quiet, always focusing on the basics, like how to hold a bow or read sheet music. But her knowledge was different. She could dissect a symphony with the kind of precision that made you wonder if she'd written it herself. The rumor took off when someone spotted an old photograph in her office. A much younger Mrs. Lang in a long gown, standing with what looked like the New York Philharmonic. When asked about it, she simply said, "That was a long time ago." Naturally, this only made people dig deeper. A few days later, a student found a video clip online of a live performance from the 90s. The first violinist looked exactly like Mrs. Lang, and her name was listed in the credits. When the clip started circulating, someone finally asked her point blank if it was her. She paused, smiled, and said, "I had my moment in the spotlight. Now it's your turn." After that, people started treating her like a rock star, begging her to perform during school concerts. Story 47. Junior year, there was this insane rumor that Kyle, the kid who was always late to school, had a pilot's license. It sounded absurd because Kyle couldn't even remember to bring his homework, let alone handle an airplane. But then one day during lunch, someone overheard him talking about a weekend flight to clear his head. Naturally, people started asking questions. Kyle brushed it off, saying, "Yeah, I fly sometimes. No big deal." No big deal. The next week, someone found a picture on social media of him standing next to a small plane, holding what looked like a flight log. When confronted, he admitted it. "I've been flying since I was 14. My uncle's an instructor." The rumor hit its peak when a science teacher joked about needing a ride to a conference, and Kyle replied, "I could take you, but gas isn't cheap." After that, kids started calling him Captain Kyle, and every time a teacher mentioned being late, someone would say, "Should have asked Kyle for a lift." Story 48. Sophomore year, there was this strange rumor about Mr. Nolan, the art teacher, being a professional forger. At first, everyone laughed because Mr. Nolan was way too clumsy. He spilled paint on his shoes at least once a week and could never find his own glasses. But then people started noticing that his examples for class assignments looked suspiciously like famous paintings. One day, during a lesson on Impressionism, someone joked, "Hey, did you paint that Monet?" Mr. Nolan just smirked and said, "If I did, I wouldn't tell you." That was all it took. By the next day, the entire school was buzzing about how he'd supposedly forged paintings for rich collectors. The tipping point came when someone found an article about a forgery scandal from years ago. The painting in question was never recovered, but the description of the artist matched Mr. Nolan almost perfectly. When asked about it, he just laughed and said, "A good artist always leaves a little mystery." After that, kids started calling him the Phantom Painter, and he played along, winking whenever someone brought it up. Story 49. There was this rumor in senior year that Jenna, the girl who was always glued to her phone, was running a secret influencer account with millions of followers. It seemed ridiculous because Jenna was so low-key in real life. She rarely posted on her personal socials and never bragged about anything. The first clue came during a group project when someone noticed her phone buzzing non-stop. When asked about it, she laughed and said, "Oh, it's just work stuff." Work stuff turned out to be sponsorship deals. A classmate later discovered an account with a ridiculous number of followers, where the girl in the posts looked exactly like Jenna, but with wigs and makeup disguising her face. When confronted, Jenna finally admitted it. "It's just a side hustle," she said, as if she wasn't raking in thousands from ads and merch. After that, everyone started asking her for social media tips, and she got roped into running the school's Instagram account. Her one condition? No selfies, please. Story 50. In sophomore year, a rumor started about Mr. Barrett, the substitute teacher, being a failed stand-up comedian. It seemed plausible because Mr. Barrett had a weird sense of humor and would occasionally drop these one-liners that left the whole class laughing or groaning. One day, during a boring lesson on world history, someone jokingly asked him to tell a joke instead. To everyone's surprise, he launched into a full comedy routine, complete with impressions and punchlines. By the end, the class was in stitches. Someone asked, "Why are you even teaching?" And he said, "Not everyone makes it to Netflix specials." That night, someone found an old YouTube clip of him performing at a comedy club. It wasn't great, his timing was off, and the audience was barely laughing. But it confirmed the rumor. When asked about it, he just shrugged and said, "Sometimes you bomb. At least the kids laugh now." After that, students started calling him Mr. Punchline, and his classes became the only ones people actually wanted to attend. Story 51. Senior year, there was a wild rumor that Mr. Hughes, the school's strictest physics teacher, had once worked on a top-secret government project. It sounded too crazy to be true. Mr. Hughes was a no-nonsense kind of guy who handed out extra homework like it was candy. But his obsession with precision and his occasional cryptic comments like, "If you only knew what's out there," made people wonder. One day during a lecture on thermodynamics, a student jokingly asked, "Mr. Hughes, did you ever invent anything cool?" He paused, gave a small smile and said, "I've worked on some interesting things." That was it. The rumor exploded. Someone claimed their uncle, who worked at an aerospace company, recognized Mr. Hughes from an old project team photo. Things escalated when a kid found an article mentioning a Dr. Hughes as part of a team that developed experimental propulsion systems for NASA. When confronted, he simply said, "That's classified," and moved on. After that, students started calling him Rocket Man, and he leaned into it, ending every lab session with, "Keep your experiments grounded, unless you're building something for space." Story 52. There was this bizarre rumor in junior year that Claire, the girl who never seemed to pay attention in class, had photographic memory and was faking her struggles to avoid standing out. At first, no one believed it because Claire was always scribbling in her notebook, doodling instead of taking notes. But then weird things started happening. During a pop quiz, Claire finished in record time and got every answer right, despite never looking at the textbook. When someone asked how she did it, she just shrugged and said, "Lucky guess." But her classmates weren't buying it. A few days later, during a history test, a student dropped their paper next to her desk. Claire glanced at it for 2 seconds, handed it back, and said, "You spelled Archduke Ferdinand wrong." Word spread fast. By the end of the month, kids were testing her memory by flashing random pages from books, and she'd recite them verbatim. When asked why she pretended to be clueless, Claire just said, "It's easier to blend in this way." After that, she became a walking cheat sheet for anyone brave enough to ask. Story 53. Sophomore year, there was a rumor that Mr. Carter, The history teacher, who always carried an old leather briefcase, was a treasure hunter in his younger days. It seemed like a joke at first. Mr. Carter was mild-mannered and seemed more interested in antique maps than anything adventurous. But he had this odd habit of randomly pulling out coins or artifacts during lectures to make his points. The rumor gained traction when he brought in an ancient Roman coin for a lesson on trade routes. Someone asked where he got it, and he smiled mysteriously, saying, "Oh, I've picked up a few things over the years." That same day, a student noticed a map sticking out of his briefcase that looked suspiciously like it had been marked with trails and X's. Things got even crazier when someone found an article about a group of amateur explorers discovering a cache of relics in South America. One of the men in the grainy photo looked a lot like a younger Mr. Carter. When asked, he just said, "I'm here to teach, not to relive my glory days." From then on, students started sneaking fake treasure maps into his briefcase, which he always returned with a smirk. Story 54. Junior year, a rumor started that Emma, the shy girl who never spoke in class, had an international modeling contract. It seemed impossible. Emma wore oversized sweaters, never wore makeup, and avoided attention at all costs. But then one day, someone found an ad for a luxury clothing brand in a magazine. The model in the picture looked exactly like her. When confronted, Emma turned red and stammered, "It's not what it looks like." Naturally, this only made people dig deeper. Someone found her name on a modeling agency's website, and another kid claimed they saw her at the airport flying to Paris over the summer. The final piece of evidence came during yearbook photo day. The photographer recognized Emma immediately and said, "Didn't I shoot you for that campaign last year?" She just nodded and whispered, "Please don't tell anyone." After that, she was the school's biggest mystery. Half the students treated her like a celebrity, while the other half respected her wish to stay low-key. Story 55. There was a wild rumor sophomore year that Mr. Keaton, the school's guidance counselor, had been a professional gambler before working in education. It sounded ridiculous because Mr. Keaton was calm, patient, and always wore the same boring suits. But he had a strange knack for using poker analogies during meetings, like, "Life's just a game of odds," or "You gotta know when to fold." The rumor really took off during a school fundraiser poker night. Mr. Keaton agreed to join a table just for fun and ended up completely dominating. By the end of the night, he had wiped out the competition without breaking a sweat. When asked how he was so good, he just smiled and said, "I've played a hand or two in my time." A few days later, someone found an old article about a man named Keaton who had made waves in the underground poker scene before disappearing. When asked if it was him, Mr. Keaton said, "If I told you, that'd ruin the mystery." After that, students started calling him the Counselor of Cards, and every meeting ended with someone jokingly asking for his bluffing tips. Story 56. In senior year, a rumor started that Mrs. Bennet, the school librarian, used to be a spy. It sounded ridiculous because Mrs. Bennet was this soft-spoken grandmotherly woman who spent most of her time recommending historical fiction and knitting during lunch breaks. But she had this strange ability to appear out of nowhere whenever someone was doing something they weren't supposed to. The rumor began when a student noticed a framed photo in her office showing her in her 20s, standing in front of what looked like an embassy building. When asked about it, she said, "Oh, those were my days abroad," and changed the subject. That sparked curiosity. Someone claimed they overheard her speaking fluent Russian to a visitor, and another swore she once disarmed a disruptive student by calmly saying, "You don't want to do that." Things escalated when a group of kids found an old newspaper article featuring someone who looked exactly like a younger Mrs. Bennet. The headline? "Foreign diplomat found safe after high-stakes rescue." When confronted, she simply smiled and said, "I've lived a colorful life, but books are my true passion." After that, students started calling her Agent Bennet, and she leaned into it, dropping cryptic comments like, "Some secrets are best left in the past." Story 57. Junior year, there was a rumor that Ethan, the kid who never paid attention in class, was secretly a chess prodigy. It seemed unlikely. Ethan spent most of his time doodling in the margins of his notebook and barely showed up to school events. But then one day during lunch, someone set up a chessboard in the cafeteria and started challenging people to games. Ethan walked by, glanced at the board, and muttered, "You're about to lose in 3 moves." The player scoffed, but followed Ethan's instructions, and sure enough, checkmate. Everyone was stunned. When asked how he knew, Ethan shrugged and said, "I just see the patterns." Later that week, someone found his name listed in an old tournament bracket online. He'd apparently won a regional championship at age 12, but had stopped competing. When pressed about it, Ethan finally admitted, "I got bored of beating people." After that, the chess club begged him to join, but he refused, saying, "I'd rather keep it casual." Story 58. Sophomore year, a rumor spread that Mr. Harris, the gym teacher, had been a stuntman before becoming a teacher. At first, no one believed it because Mr. Harris was this cheerful guy with a dad bod who seemed more into coaching dodgeball than anything death-defying. But then, during a school assembly, he demonstrated how to safely fall by launching himself off the stage and rolling to his feet like it was nothing. That got people talking. Someone found an old action movie clip featuring a stuntman who looked exactly like him, jumping out of a burning building. When confronted, Mr. Harris laughed and said, "That guy's much better looking than me." The real confirmation came during a fire drill when a student got stuck climbing out of a second-floor window. Without hesitation, Mr. Harris scaled the wall, grabbed the kid, and jumped down safely with him. After that, students started calling him Hollywood Harris, and he earned a newfound respect from everyone, even the jocks. Story 59. In senior year, there was a rumor that Maya, the quiet girl in the art club, had designed the character for a popular video game. It sounded insane because Mia was so shy, she barely spoke during group projects and always downplayed her artistic skills. But then one day, during a gaming club meeting, someone noticed a striking similarity between one of the game's main characters and a sketch in Mia's notebook. When asked about it, she turned bright red and said, "It's just fan art." Naturally, no one believed her. A few days later, someone found her name in the game's credits, listed as a freelance concept artist. When confronted, Mia finally admitted it, saying, "I just submitted some designs. I didn't think they'd actually use them." The rumor spread like wildfire, and soon half the school was asking her for tips on getting into the gaming industry. Mia stayed humble, but started offering advice during art club meetings, where attendance tripled overnight. Story 60. Sophomore year, there was a wild rumor that Mr. Peterson, the school's quietest science teacher, had once been struck by lightning and survived. It seemed ridiculous because Mr. Peterson was so reserved that he barely said more than a few words per class. But then, during a lesson on electrical currents, he casually mentioned, "Trust me, you don't want to mess with lightning." When pressed for details, he simply said, "It's a shocking experience," and moved on. That only fueled the rumor mill. Someone found an old article about a man named Peter Peterson, who had survived a lightning strike during a camping trip years ago. The man in the photo looked suspiciously like him. The story gained even more traction when a student noticed a faint scar on his arm and asked about it. Mr. Peterson just smiled and said, "Nature has its way of leaving marks." From that day forward, students treated him like a walking miracle, occasionally leaving lightning bolt doodles on his desk. He never confirmed or denied the story, but every time there was a thunderstorm, he'd say, "I've had enough excitement for one lifetime," and laugh quietly. Story 61. Junior year, a rumor started that Mr. Keller, the school's history teacher, had once been involved in a high-profile jewel heist. It sounded insane because Mr. Keller was the most ordinary person imaginable. He wore tweed jackets with elbow patches, drank tea during class, and spent more time talking about historical treaties than anything remotely exciting. But then, during a lesson on famous robberies, he said something strange. "The hardest part about a heist isn't stealing, it's the getaway." The class erupted in laughter, but Mr. Keller didn't smile. That comment set off a chain reaction. A student found an old photo of a man who looked suspiciously like him in a news article about a failed heist in the 90s. When confronted, Mr. Keller just said, "I've had my adventures, but history is my true love now." He refused to elaborate, which only made the rumor grow. By the end of the semester, students started sneaking fake diamonds onto his desk, which he'd quietly pocket with a smirk. Story 62. There was a crazy rumor in senior year that Olivia, the school's debate champion, had once been a child actor on a hit TV show. It seemed impossible because Olivia was so serious, always dressed in business casual and more focused on winning arguments than talking about her past. But one day, during a heated debate, someone in the audience whispered, "She looks so familiar." That got people digging. A week later, someone found an old sitcom clip with a character that looked exactly like Olivia, playing the precocious daughter of the main character. When asked, Olivia initially denied it. "That's not me," she said, blushing furiously. But during an assembly, a teacher slipped up and referred to her as "our little star." After that, Olivia finally admitted it. "I left that life behind," she said, rolling her eyes. "Now I just argue for fun." From that day on, students started quoting her old catchphrases during debates, much to her annoyance. Story 63. Sophomore year, there was a rumor that Mr. Grant, the janitor who always had a broom in hand, had once been a professional boxer. It seemed too wild to be true because Mr. Grant was quiet and had a noticeable limp, which didn't exactly scream athlete. But he was surprisingly strong, often lifting heavy equipment like it was nothing. The rumor gained traction when a student noticed an old championship belt hanging in the back of the janitor's closet. When asked about it, Mr. Grant shrugged and said, "I had a different career before this." That only made people more curious. A few days later, someone found a grainy old fight video online. The boxer's name wasn't Mr. Grant, but his fighting style was identical. When confronted, he just said, "Sometimes the ring teaches you things you can't learn anywhere else." After that, students started asking him for tips on self-defense, and he'd occasionally shadowbox during lunch breaks, grinning like he was back in the ring. Story 64. In junior year, a rumor spread that Mia, the school's quietest girl, had won a national baking competition. It sounded absurd because Mia barely spoke in class and never participated in school events. But then one day, during a bake sale, someone noticed that all her cookies sold out in under 10 minutes. The rumor took off when a teacher casually mentioned, "Mia's desserts are world class." A group of students decided to investigate and found a video of a national competition from 2 years ago. Sure enough, Mia was there, holding a trophy nearly as big as she was. When asked about it, she blushed and said, "That was just a hobby." But the story didn't end there. The principal later announced that Mia would be baking the desserts for the senior prom, and by the end of the year, people were calling her Master Chef Mia. She never let the fame go to her head, though. She still quietly baked cookies for her favorite teachers. Story 65. Senior year, there was a wild rumor about Mr. Turner, the biology teacher, having discovered a new species. At first, no one believed it because Mr. Turner was the kind of guy who got flustered when the projector stopped working. But he had a strange habit of telling us stories about his fieldwork in remote jungles. The rumor gained traction when someone found an old scientific journal with his name listed as a co-author on a paper about a previously unidentified amphibian. When confronted, Mr. Turner got oddly defensive, saying, "Science is about the collective effort, not individual glory." Later, during a lab session, he brought in a preserved specimen that looked unlike anything in our textbooks. When someone asked if it was his discovery, he just smiled and said, "Let's focus on the lab, shall we?" After that, students started calling him Dr. Discovery, and rumors swirled that he was secretly planning another expedition during summer break.